Hi, let's try to model uh, a particular system or particular product by incorporating all the concepts that we learned about SDLCs, about object oriented, and about BOOM. BOOM stands for Business Object Oriented Modeling. Some of that we have covered in the object oriented unit, and we'll be covering a little bit more in this particular unit. So let's carry along. Well, the names of the different phases in the software development lifecycle, they vary from SDLC to SDLC, but most SDLCs have something close to the following phases. Initiation, which is make the business case for the project or the product. Work also begins on the user experience and on drafts of architectural proof of concepts. The prototyping effort during the initiation phase should be risk driven and limited to gaining confidence that a solution is possible. Discovery phase, where you will conduct investigations leading to an understanding of the solution's desired behavior. On iterative projects like in typical tech startups, requirements analysis peaks during this phase but never disappears entirely. During this phase, our architectural proofs of concepts are also constructed. Then construction or development, which is complete the analysis and design, code, integrate and test the software. On iterative projects, these activities are performed for each iteration within the phase. Design and coding appear in all phases but peak during this phase. Then final verification and validation, also called as V&V, perform final testing before the product or service is transitioned into production. While final testing occurs in this phase, testing activities may occur throughout the SDLC. For example, before design or as a replacement for it. And finally, a closeout or deployment, where you will manage and coordinate deployment into the production and close the IT project. Production means taking it to the public, taking it to the intended users. And you will close the product, or at least you will close the current release or current objectives, and you will figure out the next objectives. So SDLC and modeling, and specifically the initiation phase. Let's go deeper into each one of these. Okay. The objectives of the initiation phase are to develop the business case for the project, establish project and product scope, and explore solutions, including the preliminary architecture. The PM assists the project manager by identifying stakeholders, business services and processes, and IT services affected by this project. By the end of this phase, key functionalities identified, such as key system use cases, user tasks, IT services, and everything. When a non-agile process is used, these requirements are baselined and subsequent changes to scope are managed in a controlled manner using a change management process. So if you are building something very, very large and you're using a non-agile process like a waterfall, uh, the requirements gathered in this particular stage would be baselined, and any changes to this would undergo a change management process. Okay, because any change here will any change after this would impact the entire architecture and can turn out to be very costly, both in terms of money and the time taken, right? So the initiation phase poses a conundrum for the PM. The purpose of this phase is to get a rough cut at the business case for a proposed IT project or product. The trouble is that without knowing the requirements, it's impossible to estimate the cost of the project. At the same time, without a business justification for the project, it is difficult to justify much requirement analysis. The answer is to do just enough research to be able to create a ballpark estimate. I mean, there's no other way to this. Okay, if you're expecting a formula here, sorry, there's no formula. The answer is to, and this is something that you'll, once you start doing this, building products small or big, again and again, you'll get very good at this, right? So you have to do just enough research to be able to create a ballpark estimate. You will do this using a number of UML techniques that keep you focused on high level needs. These techniques are as follows: business use cases. So it's a tool for identifying and describing end-to-end business processes affected by the project. activity diagrams. So you use activity diagrams to help you and stakeholders form a consensus regarding the workflow of each business use case. So सबसे पहले, first of all you started with business use case, right? Then you created an activity diagram which creates the workflow among these business use cases. Then you define the actors. Actually, you've already defined the actors, that's why there's a use case, but you mention the actors separately, which describe the users and external systems that will interact with the proposed product or project or the IT system that you are building. And then the system use cases, which are used to help stakeholders break out the end-to-end business processes into meaningful interactions with the IT system, right? This is a system use case diagram. Okay. So by the end of this phase, you will have a rough idea about the project as well as fairly comprehensive list of system use cases, and you will know which users will be involved with each system use case. You won't know the details of each system use case yet, but you will know enough to be able to ballpark the project. For example, to say whether it will take days, weeks, or months, or decades. The main deliverable of this phase is an early draft of a business requirements document or a product requirement document. Okay, it depends on how what kind of details you are covering. So I'll just talk about requirements document as such. So we take a living document approach to the PRD. You will create it in this phase and revise it as the project progresses. To help manage scope, you will save a copy of the document at the end of each phase. This is what I mean by set baseline in the following list. So baseline allows you to see what the requirements look like at various checkpoints in order to see, for example, whether a feature requested later by a stakeholder was within the scope as defined at that time or not, right? So following is a list of the steps you will carry out during the phase. Let me just list them down. So you will start by modeling the business use cases, followed by identifying the business use cases. I mean, you will to be able to model the business use case, you will identify the business use cases first of all, and you will draw a business use case diagram. Then you will scope the business use cases, and you will use activity diagram to create the workflow amongst them. Then you will you will model the system use cases, and to do that you will identify the actors, that you will design the role map amongst them. Like for example, I'm sorry, for example, in a typical enterprise, there will be hierarchies. There will be an executive, there will be a manager, there will be a VP, there will be a director, there will be a somebody else at the top, right? So you can create a role map and you can imagine how this different roles will connect with the different use cases that are being discussed or that are being modeled right now. Then you will identify the system use case packages. Basically, you will look at system use case diagram and you'll put things together. And then finally, you will look at the system use cases at the very uh, base level. And then finally, once you've identified or modeled all the behavioral models, which was the business and system use cases, then you're uh, looking at structural model. You'll start working on class diagrams for key business classes. So class diagrams are structural classes because they give a structure to the entire data and the design. And finally, you will set a baseline, right? So you'll create a PRD and you'll kick off. In a lot of agile setups, you don't have to baseline because everybody knows and believes that the requirements are uh, going to consistently change. So we should not be baselining anything. But then again, in I believe in anything that is larger than a month, 2 month, um the PRD should be baselined on a sprint to sprint scale, so that if things are, because it's very easy to get into a spiral loop where the initial discussions were in certain directions, certain decisions were taken in the first meeting, where the product should be built for so and so case, and this should happen, that should happen, and then as things move along, uh, almost a loop is formed between what was in the future discussion, because new and new requirements keep coming up, and the earlier decisions are forgotten. It's very easy that happens. So anything that is larger than a month, try to baseline it, try to at least keep some sort of minutes of the meeting, minutes of the key decisions, in one single place so that you can refer back. The next phase is of discovery. So the main objectives of the discovery phase is to understand the solution's desired behavior and baseline the architecture. This and the previous phase are the key phases for the product manager. Requirements analysis peaks during this phase. In iterative processes like agile, an analysis continues throughout the life cycle, while in waterfall processes, it is completed in this phase. Some system use cases are selected for development during this phase in order to demonstrate architectural proofs of concept. Right, so you'll pick some of the system use cases, and you will very soon see that how exactly this are picked and why they are picked. PM responsibilities during this phase focus on eliciting detailed requirements from stakeholders, analyzing and documenting them for verification by stakeholders and for use by solution providers. You will exploit a number of UML and complementary techniques to assist in requirements elicitation, analysis, and documentation during this phase. Testing in our context is not just the running of programs to uncover errors, it includes other validation and verification activities as well as test planning and preparation. Following accepted quality assurance practices, uh, I will typically introduce testing long before the code is written, right? Hence, you will find some testing activities also included in this phase. You will learn to specify the degree of technical testing, white box and system testing required from the developers, as well as how to design effective requirements based test cases, which is black box tests. The more you know about this, the better it is. But I'm not going too deep into this because um, in most of the regular setups, you do not, as a product manager, you do not have to go too deep unless you are working in a very technical scenario. By doing this during the discovery phase, not only do you allow for enough lead time to set up these tests, but you also declare measurable criteria for the project success. So if you really want to be a great product manager, I heavily recommend that you're investing that extra time to define the tests for every single use case that you are designing. So if the tests you have described don't work as advertised, the product will not be accepted, right? And please note that on an iterative project, this phase may include a number of cycles or iterations, because you will keep on doing this discovery cycle can take some time before you get out of it, because you will build something, you will iterate on it, you will take it to the market, observe how the market is responding, and then you will come and then you will may have perhaps you'll have to discover some more, or you can move to the next one, right? I'm sorry. So what are the main techniques to use in this phase? Well, like I said, you will describe the system use cases or specify the system use cases. You'll storyboard the interaction between the users and the proposed IT system as each system use case is played out. Then the state machine diagrams describing the life cycle of key business objects. Okay. Then the class diagrams describing the key business concepts and business rules that apply to business objects such as accounts, investments, complaints, claims, or whatever. Right. So the first two are behavioral, which is state machine diagram and the systems use case diagram, and the class diagram is a structural modeling, right? And what are the steps that you will go through? You will first of all do the behavior analysis, which is you will describe the system use case. Then you will describe the state behavior, which is via a state machine diagram. You will identify states of critical objects, identify state transitions, state activities, super states, concurrent states. Then you will do the structural analysis, which is the class diagram, where you will identify entity classes, model generalizations, model transient roles, model whole part relationships, it's aggregation, associate. You will analyze associations, analyze multiplicity, link system use cases to the structural model, um add attributes, add lookup tables, distribute operations, revise the class structure. You will go through the entire process essentially, because you are defining the entire product now. Then you will also specify the testing, you will specify the implementation plan, and finally you will set the baseline for development. Okay. That is all that you will be doing in this phase. If you don't worry about the state machine diagrams and all the terms, because we will be covering that very soon. Right now, just focus on the different phases, right? And like I said earlier, um, so the next phase after discovery is development. Okay, and as a PM, your core purpose here is to support the technical development. So whatever the requirements or whatever doubts that the developers may have, you have to support them in that, right? So business analysis activity during this phase depends on the life cycle approach being used, right? So on waterfall projects where all the analysis is done upfront, there is no requirements gathering or analysis during this phase, right? Because now people will be just developing and developing. However, the PM is involved in supporting quality assurance and validating that the technical design meets the requirements, right? So for example, by reviewing test plans and design specifications. On iterative projects, where requirements analysis and solution development takes place over a number of iterations, the steps described for the discovery phase are carried out during each iteration of the construction phase or the development phase, right? So the discovery phase is goes in an iterative cycle till it gets to a point where the product is very well defined, the requirements are very well taken, and there's a strong demand or there's a strong evidence to prove that the decisions taken were correct, which is when the coding should start. But there will be also scenarios where you just cannot take anything or get any reasonable evidence without the actual product, in which case you will build just enough and take it to the market. Build just enough and take it to the market, and you keep doing this, going back and forth between discovery and development cycles, or discovery and development phases, till you hit a point where you know that the product is being in general liked, and you can actually take it to the production level and to a bigger audience. To that just enough thing that I was talking about is the MVP approach, which has been popularized so much now. Then the next phase is VNV, which is verification validation. As a product manager, you will support the final testing before the completed solution is deployed. You will also review the test plans, the results, and ensure that all the requirements are tested. You will also at times start working on the marketing plan for this if you are also responsible for the marketing side of things. But that's pretty much it in this phase. Typically, you will not define the testing conditions and everything, but you will definitely define the testing criteria. You should be the one who is defining that. And finally, the closeout, right? So the business analyst or the product manager supports the deployment process, reviewing transition plans and participating in post implementation review, which is also called retrospective. Okay, you will do a retrospective after the closeout has happened, after the product has been built and has been shipped. You will do a retrospective after a week or after a few days to just look back and see whether the impact is equal to what was estimated, or what is the gap between the estimated versus real, right? So the next question is, which is very often asked to me, that okay, this is all great, I've understood the overview of the entire process, but what comes first, attributes or operations, right? So the object oriented principle of encapsulation suggests that in understanding how each object is used in a system, it's more important to know its operations than its attributes, right? Operations are all that objects see of each other. However, within the context of business analysis or what you will be doing, it's usually easy to identify the attributes of a class, right? The attributes show up as a field on screens and reports, right? And it's often fairly obvious what class of objects they describe. Ascribing operations to classes is not quite as easy, right? And I like to do the easy thing first, right? I'll typically try to start with operations, but because attributes is much easier to define, that okay, this is going to be a name field, this is going to be a email field, this is going to be a mobile field, this is going to be a calendar field, and so on. It's very easy to describe that piece, but describing the operations for each of these that needs to be done on each of these attributes is slightly tricky. So most of the time I start with operations, um, and as we go along the operation, because I think I take the use case approach, that if I'm the end customer wants X, to achieve that X I need to do Y, and I also need to do Y prime, and I also need to do Y double prime, and so on. And while describing that, I end up creating the operations, and then also end up creating the attributes, sorry, attributes for the objects. And it also helps me in defining the op classes. So it's not a very straightforward process that you do X, you define operations, and then you define something else, then you define something else. It doesn't happen like that. It actually happens through a evolutionary approach, where you start with something. I start with operations, and I'll look at all the operations that should go in the product for to achieve the final outcome of the customer. And then while defining those operations, I'll end up defining the attributes, the classes, and the relationships, and everything else, right? So in a nutshell, feel free to make changes to the order described for analyzing operations, attributes, or any other step, right? So consider this BOOM, which is the business object oriented modeling, your starting point. By following it, you will get to the end result, comprehensive requirements, relatively effortlessly. But you should over time customize the process as you see fit. Okay. So just start early and just fill in the blanks. Do not waste too much time figuring out what's the best practice and this and that. Typically, just start with the end customer, the end experience, and work backwards. So far we have spoken a lot about the behavioral model. I want to talk about um I want to talk about the structural model in this particular slide. So the structural model defines, just to jog your memory, structural model defines what is the system, and behavioral model is describes how the system should work or what will the system do. Okay. Ideally, behavioral and structural analysis should be performed in parallel. You should be doing both the things together, right? And for the first timers, difficult it's very difficult to actually jump between these two. Uh, so I'm just describing one of the approaches that I take often. So during the initiation phase, that is very early, you identify the system use cases in the behavioral model. Okay. Nouns discovered during this process are added to the structural model if they relate to new business concepts. For example, the system use case adjudicate loan application introduces the term loan application, which you define in the structural model. That there's something called loan application. Let me just use that. It's a noun. So let me use that as a structure. You continued working on the structural model during the initiation phase, describing key business classes and their relationships to each other. Following the initiation phase, as you describe each system use case, you verify it against the existing structural model. Does the system use case comply with rules expressed in the structural model? Has the system use case introduced new classes? Right? So you keep going, you keep evolving this entire model that you have created. Okay. And finally, as you go along, as you go through the each system use case, finally the structural model would be pretty much there and will be fully verified. Finally, I just want to touch upon how do you tailor a boom for your particular scenario, right? As I said earlier, just take all of these steps as a checklist, as a guideline, okay? And not every step is necessary, right? Uh, and very simply, just look at if it's going to make a difference in the outcome, do it. Otherwise, just don't do it. What I have attempted to do for you is create a comprehensive set of things that you can cover up. Now, depending on what kind of projects that you're working on, what kind of products you're working, you might have to do everything, you might have to do a part of it, right? So, for example, degree of documentation and analysis required depends on a number of factors. So degree of formality versus adaptiveness of the life cycle. Correct. So is it a banking application, or is it something very very mission critical, or is it okay to be very adaptive in the life cycle? What is way more important? For example, are you sending men to the moon, or are you creating another filter, image filter app, right? So definitive or empirical life cycle. For empirical life cycle, do as little documentation as you can get away with. Do it as late in the process as possible. Just don't baseline the requirements unless they are in the process of being implemented. That is empirical life cycle. Correct. You're just going empirically that yeah, this is how it should work. Correct. uh, you should also look at iterative or sequential approach in SDLC. What approach do you want to take? And you can also take both of them. For certain things, you can take a sequential approach. For certain things, you can take iterative approach, right? Then the degree of uncertainty tolerated by the sponsor and the budget. Sponsor here basically means the business team or the person who is sponsoring or backing the project. What is the degree of uncertainty that he's comfortable with, the sponsor is comfortable with, and the budget that you have, right? Is if there is a regulatory requirement, if there is regulatory requirement, you would need to do certain things very very clearly. You'll have to outline those requirements much ahead. The size of team and the physical distance between the PM solution team and the business stakeholders, right? If the team is remote, if the team is separated out, then you cannot be just walking up the table and discussing verbally, right? You'll have to document it much better because it can be interpreted in so many different ways, and so you need to have clear understanding of what is expected, what is not expected, what is to be done, what is not to be done, right? Then the developers capability, certain developers are very very smart in terms of identifying the requirements and figuring out all the additional test cases and everything that needs to go through, that needs to be taken care of, while certain developers are not so capable or very early in their career, so they do not have the experience to actually consider all the scenarios or all the things that in which this particular a particular feature can work. And hence a product manager will have to document further and will have to give a proper guideline. Finally, in-house or vendor solution, so that also kind of determines what kind of documentation and what kind of analysis you have to do. And finally, the maturity of organization. If the entire organization is very very young, like a very young startup 2 people team, you will typically not document anything, you will just run with it, right? You'll just run whether you start building something. And as you go along and you start realizing that okay, when you are adding a new developer, it is taking you at least 3 days to just explain the code and explain the entire functionalities, then it will make sense to just sit down once, spend a day and just document every single thing, so that when a new person joins in, he has a certain ready document to refer to. I hope this is clear. Then last thing I want to touch upon is what do you show stakeholders? So what should you be building? This PRD, and then I spoke about state machine diagrams, I spoke about so many other things. Well, not every document you produce is aimed at the same audience, right? You need to tailor what you show to the audience that will see it. So if you're presenting to the CEO, obviously you need a very different approach to your product. You want to showcase the impact, you want to showcase the nitty-gritties and so on. But if you're talking to the CTO, or if you're talking to your developers, or you're talking to the users, the same product will a different perspective of the product will be showcased to each of these different audience, because you want to tailor it to them. All the artifacts that we will be covering are appropriate for developers and other analysts on your team, but not all are appropriate for business stakeholders, at least not without some translation. The following is a summary of the artifacts that we will be covering and how they are presented to business stakeholders. Okay, you may want to reread this section once you have learned more about these artifacts, so don't worry about it too much. Okay, so activity diagrams, you will show this to the stakeholders, but only use the basic modeling elements. Examples of other elements and inappropriate for stakeholders include signals and expansion regions and things like that. Okay, activity diagrams with partitions, that is swim lanes, help business stakeholders visualize the internal workflow of a business use case or business process, right? Simple activity diagrams attached to system use cases help them visualize how the users will interact with the HCI, that is the computer, or the uh, will how the users will interact with the computers or with the system that you're developing, right? Then the state machine diagrams. It shows the business stakeholders simple diagrams using which indicates the states and transitions, but it excludes all kind of advanced features. Just keep it as simple as possible, right? So you don't have to explain the internal actions and what will happen when a certain edge case will happen and this and that. If they do ask about it, then mention it, but just keep it a little high level. Then comes your use case diagrams. You will show these to stakeholders, but only include actors and their relationships to the use cases. Business use case diagrams provide stakeholders with an overview of who participates in which processes. System use case diagrams provide a useful overview of who does what with the IT solution, right? As you can imagine, system use case is a little more involved. So, however, you can hide other modeling elements such as include, extend, generalization relationships, etc., etc. These are usual. These are useful for the internal team um, in reducing redundancies, but they are apt to confuse stakeholders. Stakeholders will go bonkers if they see so much of stuff, right? Um, and only include anything extra like relationships and things like that only if the stakeholders are comfortable with it. The next is use case descriptions, decision tables, decision trees, and so on. Well, you should definitely show this to stakeholders. Keep it simple, but yeah, definitely show this to stakeholders, and they are in general very simple as by design. Finally, class diagrams, you do not have to show these to stakeholders. Okay, uh, but if they do contain important business rules, okay, convert those rules to text and obtain sign off on them. So for example, when will refunds take place, when will a user be converted into a paid user, all of these scenarios are very very important business rules, so you would rather want to make sure that you are taking a sign off on the right stuff. Similarly, all kind of regulatory requirement, you should definitely get a sign off from the legal team or from somebody else who will be responsible for it. Similarly, invoice, if you're creating invoices, you have to get the sign off from the chief finance officer or somebody like that. Got it? So I'll suggest that you come back to this session, this slide once again, once you have gone through each one of these diagrams in one of the future sessions. Okay, so that's it for now, guys. So to conclude, uh, we understood what are the different SDLC steps, what are different phases, what does it entail in each one of them, what is the different role, what are the roles of a product manager in each of these phases, and how it connects with object oriented and with business object oriented modeling, which is boom. Okay, so that's it for now. Take care.